Elena Vance stood in the middle of her small living room, surrounded by towering walls of premium cardboard that felt like a fortress against the encroaching darkness of her previous life. The silence of the apartment was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of poverty, but a quiet space for her mind to process the impossible. If you're enjoying this Arctic adventure, please subscribe and enable notifications to stay updated with each new chapter of our story. Now settle in and immerse yourself in the tale ahead. We value our community's engagement. Feel free to share your location and thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. $5,000 sat in her digital wallet, a sum that only 12 hours ago would have felt like a king's ransom. Now it was a tether to a reality she could barely comprehend. Elena Vance, a brilliant former biochem researcher and forensic auditor turned struggling mother, found herself performing a mental audit of her own soul. Her analytical mind, which had spent years dissecting the cold, hard truths of financial ledgers, was now trying to reconcile the warmth of a stranger's generosity with the sharp edge of her own deep-seated suspicion. She walked over to the first box, the one containing the specialized organic formula. She picked up a tin, the metal cool against her palms. In the fluorescent light of the kitchen, she could see the reflection of a woman who looked like a ghost of the person she used to be. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a fraying elastic, and her eyes, though tired, held a sudden, dangerous spark of hope. This wasn't just milk, it was time. It was the ability to stop counting every cent, to stop watering down the bottles, and to stop the frantic internal math that dictated whether she could afford bread or bus fare. She thought of the text she had sent in the cold, hollow hour of midnight, a plea born of pure, unadulterated desperation. It had been a Hail Mary, a message intended for a brother who had his own struggles, yet it had landed in the lap of a man whose wealth was so vast it was almost abstract. Caleb Sterling, the reclusive billionaire widower who had responded, was a name Elena knew from the periphery of her old professional life. He was the ghost mogul, a man who had built Sterling Nexus into a global powerhouse before retreating behind the tinted glass of his penthouse after the loss of his wife. Why had he answered her? Why had he not simply blocked the number or sent a polite wrong number message? Instead, he had followed up with a question that had broken her. Is your baby going to be okay? It was a question that bypassed her defenses and hit the core of her failure as a provider. To have that failure answered with $5,000 and a truckload of supplies felt like a miracle, but Elena Vance was not a woman who believed in miracles without investigating the fine print. As she moved to the second box, she pulled out a cashmere onesie. It was impossibly soft, a luxury that felt foreign in her hands. She thought of Sophie, currently sleeping in the other room, her tiny stomach finally full and settled. The baby didn't know that her world had changed. She didn't know that the man who had sent this gift had somehow known her name. That was the detail that kept Elena's forensic mind on high alert. How did he know? Had he tracked the number? Had he looked her up in a matter of seconds? The level of precision was staggering. It spoke of a man who didn't just have money, but who had access to every digital thread of her existence. Elena began to unpack the third box, revealing the stroller. It was a masterpiece of engineering, lightweight and sleek. As she clicked the wheels into place, the mechanical sound reminded her of the laboratories she used to inhabit. Before the company she worked for folded, before the daycare shut down, and before the father of her child ghosted her, Elena had been a rising star in her field. She had been the one who could spot a decimal point error in a 1,000-page document, the sharp, quiet force that made corrupt accountants tremble. Now she was a woman assembling baby gear on a cracked kitchen floor, wondering if she was being groomed or being rescued. Her deep flaw, that fierce independence born from trauma, told her to pack it all back up. It told her to send the money back, to walk away before the strings became a noose. But as she looked at the mountain of diapers and the high-end puree packets, she realized she no longer had the luxury of being proud. Her daughter's health was the only ledger that mattered now. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of her old life and the promise of a new one, and felt a strange, terrifying shift in her identity. She was no longer just a victim of a systemic failure. She was a variable in a billionaire's experiment. She reached for the final envelope again, her fingers tracing the elegant cursive. She deserves better than barely getting by. Caleb. The words weren't just about Sophie. They were a critique of the world that had allowed Elena to fall so far. Caleb Sterling hadn't just given her supplies, he had given her a mirror, and for the first time in years, she didn't hate the woman looking back. She saw a mother who had fought for her child and won, even if the win had come through a wrong digit. Elena stood up, her legs stiff from sitting on the linoleum. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, in a lonely penthouse overlooking the skyline, Caleb Sterling was waiting for her next move. He had issued an invitation to Sterling Nexus, a no-strings conversation that she knew would be anything but simple. She knew she was entering a den of lions, specifically people like Julian Vane, the corrupt CFO who would eventually view her presence as a threat to his machine. But she was not afraid. The audit of her life was complete, and the results were clear. She had nothing left to lose and everything for Sophie to gain. She began to organize the supplies, stacking the formula tins with the same precision she had once used to stack data logs. Every tin was a day of security. Every diaper was a moment of peace. By the time she was finished, the kitchen looked like a distribution center for hope. She took a photo of Sophie's new giraffe sitting on top of the stroller and almost sent it to the stranger, but she stopped. She wouldn't be a charity case. She would be a professional. If Caleb Sterling wanted a conversation, she would give him one, but she would do it on her terms, with her dignity intact and her analytical mind fully engaged. The stranger's gift was a catalyst. It had turned the tired mother into a sharp auditor again. As she finally lay down to sleep, the blue light of her phone was no longer a beacon of desperation, but a tool for her own transformation. Tomorrow, she would walk into Sterling Nexus, not as a woman who needed $50, but as a woman who would eventually uncover the millions being stolen under Caleb's nose. The accident of a wrong number was over. The strategy of Elena Vance had just begun.
Maya Collins didn't wake up to the sun. She woke up to the silence of a baby who was finally, mercifully sleeping through a full stomach. For months, her internal clock had been calibrated to the frantic, high-pitched frequency of Sophie's hunger. But this morning, the apartment was still. The air was cold, the radiator clanking with the half-hearted effort of a building that had seen better decades. But as Maya sat up on her mattress, the weight of the previous night's desperation felt strangely lighter. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers brushing against the plastic casing with a sense of dread. She expected to see a string of confused or angry messages from the stranger she had accidentally propositioned for formula money. She expected the one wrong digit to have resulted in a digital slamming of the door. Instead, the screen flicked to life, and the notification from her banking app hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Her breath hitched, caught in a throat that had been tight with anxiety for longer than she could remember. She tapped the app, her thumb hovering over the glass as she waited for the biometric scan to clear. When the balance loaded, Maya felt the world tilt. $10,000. It sat there in a clean digital row, 4 zeros that represented more security than she had possessed since the day her accounting firm folded and her life had begun its slow, agonizing unraveling. It wasn't just $50 for formula. It wasn't a temporary fix. It was a year of rent. It was heat. It was the ability to look at Sophie and not see a countdown clock of mounting debt. Her hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that made the phone vibrate against her palms. She swiped to her messages, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There was a new text from the unknown number, sent just as the sun began to peek over the jagged skyline of the city. It was short, devoid of the flowery language or the hidden barbs she had come to expect from the world. It's a down payment on a future, not a gift. Come to Blackwood Tower at 9 a.m. Ask for the executive elevator. Ethan. Maya sank back against the headboard, the faded fabric scratching against her neck. Ethan. The name felt heavy, resonant with power she had only ever observed from the sidewalk. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the city knew of Ethan Blackwood. He was the man in the glass tower, the reclusive architect of a tech empire who had retreated from the public eye years ago, leaving behind a trail of whispers about his coldness and his brilliance. To the world, he was a billionaire mogul. To Maya, until 5 minutes ago, he was a wrong number. Her analytical mind, the part of her that used to thrive on the cold logic of financial ledgers and tax codes, began to whir into high gear. This was the moment where her deep flaw, that fierce, jagged independence, reared its head. She didn't want to be a charity case. She didn't want to be the poor single mom who was shocked by the benevolence of a king. She wanted her life back, but she wanted to earn it. Yet, as she looked across the room at Sophie, who was stirring in her crib, Maya realized that her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. If a billionaire wanted a conversation in exchange for $10,000, she would give him the best professional audit of his life. The transformation took an hour. Maya moved through the apartment with a renewed sense of purpose, a sharp, quiet force returning to her movements. She dug through the back of her closet, pulling out the one blazer she hadn't sold to the local consignment shop, a charcoal gray piece that still fit, even if it was a little loose around the waist. She pulled her blonde hair back into a tight, professional knot, the woman in the mirror looking less like a victim of circumstance and more like the forensic accountant she had once been. She packed Sophie's diaper bag with the last of the supplies, her mind already 3 moves ahead. The journey to the center of the city felt like a fever dream. The bus was crowded, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and exhaust, but Maya sat near the window, her hand resting protectively on Sophie's carrier. As the bus turned the corner and the obsidian glass of Blackwood Tower came into view, the sheer scale of Ethan's world began to settle in. It was a monument of precision and wealth, a needle of steel piercing the gray clouds. Maya stepped off the bus and stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking up. She felt small, a speck of dust against the polished marble of the lobby, but then she felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the digital proof that she belonged inside. The lobby was a cathedral of silent efficiency. Men and women in suits that cost more than Maya's car moved with the choreographed grace of the elite. As Maya approached the security desk, she felt the familiar sting of self-consciousness, the weary mother in her bracing for a cold dismissal. "I'm here to see Ethan Blackwood. My name is Maya Collins." The security guard didn't look up at first, his finger hovering over a tablet, but as soon as the name registered, his posture shifted. He stood a little straighter, his eyes flicking to the baby carrier and then back to Maya's face. "Of course, Miss Collins. Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Please use the executive elevator on the far right. It's been programmed for your floor." The elevator ride was silent, a smooth, pressurized ascent that made Maya's ears pop. She watched the floor numbers climb. Her reflection in the mirrored walls showed a woman who was terrified but unwilling to show it. When the doors slid open on the 60th floor, she wasn't met with a boardroom or a desk. She was met with silence and a view of the city that made the skyscrapers below look like toys. The executive floor was an open expanse of wood and glass, but tucked into the corner, just past a massive mahogany desk, was a door that stood slightly ajar. Maya walked toward it, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She expected to find a man in a three-piece suit surrounded by lawyers and assistants. Instead, she found Ethan Blackwood standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a simple black sweater, his shoulders broad, his presence filling the room with a powerful, calm energy that felt both intimidating and strangely grounding. "You're early," he said, not turning around. His voice was low, a velvet baritone that carried no judgment. "I didn't think it was the kind of meeting one should be late for," Maya replied, adjusting Sophie's carrier. Ethan turned then, and for the first time, Maya saw the man behind the Ghost Mogul headlines. His eyes were sharp, observant, taking in everything from her thrifted blazer to the way she held her daughter. He didn't look at her with pity, he looked at her with a profound, unsettling recognition. "The $10,000, Maya started, her independence flaring. "I need to know what the terms are. I don't take money I haven't earned." Ethan walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. He looked down at Sophie, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare, tender moment that broke through his professional mask. "The terms are simple, Maya," he said, looking back at her. "I have a company full of people who tell me what I want to hear. I need someone who sees the numbers for what they actually are. I didn't send that money because you're a single mother. I sent it because you're the only person who has spoken to me with total honesty in 5 years." He gestured toward a desk in the corner, one already set up with a high-end monitor and a stack of internal audit logs. "There is a crack in my foundation, and I think you're the only one sharp enough to find it. Now, shall we get to work?" Maya looked at the desk, then at Ethan, and finally at the shocking deposit on her phone. The accident of the wrong number was gone. The reality of the right destination had arrived.
Elena Vance stood before the monolithic glass and steel spine of sterling Nexus, her hand white-knuckled on the handle of the matte black stroller Caleb had sent the day before. The building reached into the low Seattle clouds like a silver needle, reflecting a city that usually felt indifferent to her existence. But today, the skyscraper felt like an invitation. Elena Vance, a brilliant former biochem researcher and forensic auditor, adjusted the collar of her only professional blazer, feeling the familiar weight of Sophie's presence in the carriage as a grounding force against the fluttering anxiety in her chest. She was a woman who had spent years dissecting the cold, hard truths of financial ledgers, yet no amount of data could have prepared her for the sheer scale of the world she was about to enter. Her deep flaw, that fierce, jagged independence, whispered that she should turn around and disappear into the crowd, but the memory of the empty formula can on her kitchen floor pushed her through the revolving doors. The lobby was a cathedral of high-tech minimalism, silent except for the muffled hum of high-speed elevators and the rhythmic click of expensive heels on polished stone. As Elena approached the security desk, she expected the usual friction, the long wait, the suspicious glances at her thrifted clothes, the polite but firm dismissal. Instead, the moment she uttered her name, the receptionist's face lit up with immediate professional recognition. Elena was ushered toward a private executive elevator, a pressurized capsule of wood and brass that bypassed the common floors of the building. As the numbers climbed, she watched her reflection in the mirrored walls, seeing a woman who was weary but possessed a sharp, quiet force that was beginning to resurface after months of dormancy. When the doors slid open on the 60th floor, the first thing that hit her wasn't the opulence, but the view. The entirety of the Puget Sound stretched out beneath them, a gray-blue expanse that made the rest of the world look like a miniature model. Caleb Sterling, the reclusive billionaire widower, was standing by the window, his back to her. He wasn't the cold, untouchable figure portrayed in the media. He looked more like a man carrying the weight of his own empire on a pair of broad, tired shoulders. He turned slowly, his eyes, sharp and observant, immediately finding Elena and then Sophie. "You're on time, Elena," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no hint of the pity she so deeply dreaded. "I don't leave debts unpaid, Mr. Sterling," replied Elena, her ironclad sense of dignity flaring in her tone. "I'm here to thank you for the supplies and to find out what you really want. People in your position don't send $5,000 to strangers by mistake." Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him down a wide, quiet hallway lined with original art and silent security cameras. At the end of the hall, he stopped before a door that looked identical to the others, but when he pushed it open, Elena's breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't an office, it was a nursery, illuminated by soft recessed lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. It was stocked with everything a child could need: a handcrafted wooden crib, a plush changing station, and shelves filled with books and toys that were educational rather than just expensive. There were even blackout curtains and a small ergonomic chair for a mother to rest in while leaving the carriage outside. "This is too much," Elena whispered, her hands trembling as she looked at a small plush giraffe sitting on the rug, a twin to the one currently tucked into Sophie's stroller. "Why would you do this for a child you don't even know?" Caleb stepped into the room, his presence filling the space but somehow not overwhelming it. "Because I know what it feels like to walk into a building alone, Elena, and I know what it feels like to lose someone you weren't prepared to save." He looked at Sophie, a brief, tender expression flickering across his features before he turned back to Elena with the focus of a man who had built empires. "I didn't bring you here for charity. I brought you here because I have a company full of people who are too afraid of me to tell the truth. I looked into your background. You were one of the best forensic auditors in the state before your firm collapsed. You see patterns where others see noise." Elena felt her analytical mind whirring, the auditor in her already beginning to scan the subtext of his words. "You have a breach," she stated, her voice regaining the sharp edge that had once defined her professional life. "I have a drift in my financials that my current CFO, Julian Vane, claims is just market fluctuation," Caleb replied, his jaw tightening. "But I think it's a machine, a very sophisticated, very quiet machine that is bleeding Sterling Nexus dry from the inside. I need someone who doesn't owe Julian anything. I need someone who isn't afraid of the fire." He walked over to a desk that sat just across the glass partition from the nursery, a workspace designed so a mother could work while keeping a direct eye on her child. He slid a folder across the mahogany surface. Elena opened it and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. It was a 3-month temporary position as the head of internal audit, with a salary that would not just pay her rent, but would provide Sophie with a future that Elena had only dared to dream of during the cold, hollow hours of her previous life. "No strings, Elena," Caleb said, echoing his message from the night before. "You find the crack in my foundation, or you prove me wrong. Either way, at the end of 90 days, you walk away with enough to never water down a bottle of formula again. You take the job because you're the best person for it, not because you're a single mother." Elena looked through the glass at Sophie, who was currently babbling at the plush giraffe, then back at Caleb Sterling.
Her deep flaw, the fear of being a redemption project for a billionaire, struggled against the undeniable reality of the opportunity. But as she looked at the audit logs already pulled up on the monitor, her mind was already identifying the first baseline deviation. The accident of the wrong number text was fading. The strategy of a partnership was beginning to take its place. "I'll take the job, Mr. Sterling," Elena said, her voice steady and certain. "But if I find something ugly, I won't bury it for you." Caleb offered a small, worn smile, the first one she had truly seen. "That's exactly why I hired you. Welcome to Sterling Nexus, Elena."
Elena Vance didn't believe in ghosts, but as she sat in the quiet of her glass-walled office at Sterling Nexus, she was beginning to believe in hauntings. Outside the partition, the sun was a distant, pale orb sinking toward the horizon, casting long, geometric shadows across the plush rugs of the nursery, where Sophie lay sleeping. The contrast was jarring, the soft, safe warmth of her daughter's presence on one side of the glass, and the cold, jagged reality of a multi-million-dollar deception on the other. Elena Vance, the brilliant former forensic auditor, was no longer the woman who sat in the dark counting formula scoops. She was a predator on a scent, her analytical mind whirring with the familiar electric hum of a hunt. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green and white of the audit logs, searching for the Trinox pattern that had begun to emerge from the static of the third quarter reports. For the first 3 days, she had played the role of the diligent, overwhelmed new hire. She had reconciled petty cash, reviewed travel expenses, and kept her head down while Julian Vane, the sharp-jawed CFO, passed her office with a look of barely concealed amusement. To him, she was Caleb's redemption project, a charity case intended to keep the boss distracted while the real business of the empire continued. But Julian hadn't factored in Elena's deep flaw, her refusal to take anything at face value. She didn't just look at the spreadsheets, she looked at the ghost credentials behind them. She tracked the login timestamps, the IP addresses, and the subtle, rhythmic pulse of data that indicated a machine was working where a human should be. The break came at 4:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Elena had been cross-referencing vendor payouts with project codes when she hit a baseline deviation that felt like a tripwire. A company called Trinox Solutions LLC had been receiving a steady stream of payments for biochem diagnostic consulting. The amounts were always strategic, just under the $25,000 threshold that would trigger an automatic internal review. On their own, they were pebbles. Together, they were a landslide. Elena leaned closer to the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the tax ID for Trinox and ran it through a private business registry she still had access to from her old life. The result was a digital dead end, a mailbox drop in Delaware, and a single executive agent who specialized in corporate anonymity. But it wasn't the shell company that chilled her. It was the access point. Elena pulled the system logs for every Trinox approval. The names on the digital signatures were different every time. A junior analyst in London, a project manager in Singapore, a lead developer in San Francisco. It looked like a decentralized global consensus. However, when Elena dug into the raw metadata, she saw the fingerprint. Every single one of those approvals had been generated by the same device ID, a ghost credential that was hijacking real employee accounts to bypass the triple audit security Caleb had bragged about. Someone wasn't just stealing, they were wearing the skin of the company to do it. The scale of the Trinox pattern was breathtaking. Over the last 18 months, more than $12 million had vanished into the Delaware void, masked under the guise of legitimate research and development.
It was a masterpiece of financial engineering designed to run unnoticed for a decade. Elena felt a surge of that sharp, quiet force that once made her the top of her field. She wasn't just a mother trying to survive anymore. She was the only person in a 60-story building who knew the house was being robbed from the inside. Her independence, usually a barrier to trust, now felt like her greatest weapon. She didn't owe Julian Vane a single moment of loyalty, and she didn't fear the fire he was stoking. She spent the next few hours building a hidden directory on her local drive, a digital safe house, where she began to compile her proof. She mapped the flow of funds, the hijacked logins, and the specific memos where Julian Vane had streamlined the compliance protocols to remove the very cross-checks that would have caught this. It wasn't a mistake, it was a planned extraction. Julian hadn't just been sloppy, he had been the architect. As she clicked through the files, Elena felt the weight of the stakes. This wasn't just about Caleb Sterling's billions, it was about the research Sterling Nexus was doing, the life-saving biochem patents that were being bled for the sake of a CFO's offshore accounts. Just as she was preparing to encrypt the folder, a soft knock on her office door made her jump. She quickly minimized the window, her heart racing as if she had been caught in a crime herself. It was Caleb. He was leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened, looking more like the man who had sent a $5,000 wrong number text than the mogul who owned the skyline. He looked past her at Sophie, who was stirring in the nursery, then back at Elena's tense posture. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Elena," he said, his voice low and observant. "I have," she replied, her voice steadying as she leaned back in her chair. "I've found the crack in your foundation, Mr. Sterling, and it's not a crack, it's a tunnel." Caleb walked into the room, his presence grounding the electric tension of the moment. "Tell me." Elena didn't use the jargon of an auditor. She spoke with the raw, ironclad certainty of someone who had seen the bottom of an empty formula can and refused to look at one again. She showed him the Trinox shell, the hijacked credentials, and the $12 million hole in his legacy. She watched his face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes hardened into a cold, dangerous flint. He wasn't surprised that someone was stealing, he was devastated that it was happening under the umbrella of the company he had built to honor his late wife. "Julian," Julian said, the name sounding like a curse. "He's good, Caleb, he's very good," Elena warned, her protective instincts for her new life flaring. "He's been watching the numbers drift for a long time, making sure no one else looked too closely. He thinks I'm just a distraction. He thinks I'm a charity case." Caleb looked at the monitor, then at Elena. The tender expression she had seen in the nursery returned for a fleeting second. "You're the furthest thing from charity I've ever seen, Elena. You're a reckoning." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a moment before he pulled back, maintaining the professional distance that kept them both safe. "I need you to keep digging, but you have to be careful. If Julian suspects you found the device ID, he won't just try to fire you, he'll try to destroy you." Elena thought of the nights without power, the fear of the landlord's knock, and the cold, hollow hour of her lowest point. She looked at Sophie, then at the reclusive billionaire who had given her a chance to be herself again. "Let him try," she said, the words echoing the defiance of a woman who had already survived the worst the world could throw at her. "I've spent the last year being invisible. It's time I started being inconvenient." As Caleb left her office, the Trinox pattern glowing on her screen felt like a map to her own redemption. The accident of the wrong number had led her here, but it was her precision that would keep her. She began to pack her bag, her mind already 3 moves ahead, planning the bait that would eventually draw the CFO into the light. She was no longer just a struggling mom, she was the director of internal audit in all but name, and the ghost in the machine had finally met its match.
Elena Vance felt the temperature in her office drop long before Julian Vane actually stepped through the door. It was the shadow of the man, a curated corporate chill that preceded his presence like a storm front. Elena Vance, the brilliant former forensic auditor, kept her eyes fixed on her dual monitors, the Trinox pattern masked behind a benign-looking spreadsheet of quarterly utility costs. Her analytical mind was already calculating the trajectory of the confrontation. She had known this moment was coming. You don't hunt a shark in his own waters without expecting him to turn and show his teeth. She adjusted her glasses, her heart a steady, purposeful thrum against her ribs, refusing to let the weary mother she had been only weeks ago take the wheel. Julian didn't knock. He leaned against the doorframe, his charcoal Italian suit catching the afternoon light in a way that screamed of unearned confidence. He looked at the glass partition where Sophie was napping in her crib, the custom-built nursery that had become a point of gossip on the executive floor. For a moment, his lip curled in a sneer of practiced condescension. To a man like Vane, motherhood was a weakness to be exploited, a charity case label he could use to delegitimize Elena's presence in the building. "It's a touching scene, Elena, truly," Julian said, his voice a smooth, calculated drawl. He stepped into the room, not waiting for an invitation, and sat on the edge of her desk. Caleb has always had a soft spot for a tragic backstory. It's one of the few flaws in an otherwise impressive man, but I think we both know that you're a little overqualified for the pity hire role, don't you? Elena didn't look up, her fingers clicking rhythmically on the keyboard. "I don't believe in pity, Julian. I believe in data, and the data suggests that my presence here is quite necessary." The data, right. Julian leaned in closer, the smell of expensive cologne and cold ambition filling the small space between them. "I noticed you've been spending a lot of time in the raw metadata of the R&D accounts, specifically accounts that have already been cleared and closed by my team. It's a lot of extra work for a woman with a young child. One might think you're looking for things that aren't there." "Or looking for things that are hidden in plain sight," Elena countered, finally turning her chair to face him. Her sharp, quiet force was on full display now, her gaze level and unflinching. Her deep flaw, that fierce, jagged independence, meant she didn't know how to back down even when the predator was inches from her face. Forensic auditing is like looking at a ghost. You don't see the spirit, you see the way the curtains move when it walks by. And right now, Julian, the curtains are shaking. The CFO's expression hardened, the mask of corporate civility slipping just enough to reveal the jagged edges of the man beneath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver pen, clicking it with a rhythmic, irritating snap. "Let's stop the metaphors, Elena. You're a smart woman. You've had a hard year. You were broke, your electricity was cut, and you were begging for formula on the street. Caleb gave you a life raft, but you need to realize that I'm the one who controls the tide in this building." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline as if he already owned every bit of glass and steel in sight. "I'm prepared to offer you a way out that preserves your dignity. You've been here, what, 2 weeks? Let's call it a cultural mismatch. I'll authorize a severance package today, 6 months salary, full benefits, and a glowing recommendation that will get you back into any top-tier firm in the country. You walk out that door with Sophie, you take the nice severance, and you never look back at a sterling Nexus ledger again." Elena felt the weight of the offer. It was the easy path, the path that would secure Sophie's future without the risk of a corporate war. But she also saw the Trinox pattern in her mind, the $12 million being bled from Caleb's legacy to fund Julian's private empire. If she took the money, she wasn't just taking a severance, she was taking a bribe. She was becoming a part of the machine she had been hired to dismantle. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, her voice a low, dangerous silk.
Julian turned back to her, his face a shadow in the afternoon light. The narrative changes, Elena. A struggling mother with a history of financial instability is suddenly found to be accessing secure accounts without authorization. A few digital footprints are planted, a few ghost credentials are traced back to your terminal, and suddenly you're not a whistleblower. You're the thief who tried to frame the CFO to cover your own tracks. He walked back to the desk, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. Think about your daughter, Elena. Think about the cold, hollow hour you just escaped. Do you really want to go back there? Because if you stay on this path, I won't just fire you. I'll make sure you're unhireable. I'll make sure the state takes a very close look at the stability of your home. A silent exit is the only right number you have left to call. Elena felt a cold shiver of rage. He was threatening her child. He was using her trauma as a weapon. But Julian Vane had made one fatal mistake. He assumed that Elena's fear of being broke was stronger than her ironclad sense of dignity. He thought he was talking to a victim, but he was talking to an auditor who had already found his fingerprints on the crime scene. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Elena said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of containing her fury. "You do care about the stability of my home, and my home is built on the truth. You can threaten my severance, and you can try to frame me, but you've already left a trail. The Trinox pattern is more than just a drift in the financials. It's a signature, and I've already sent a copy of that signature to a safe house server you can't touch." The snap of Julian's pen stopped. For the first time, Elena saw a genuine flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was gone in a second, replaced by a mask of cold, professional hatred, but it was enough. She had drawn blood. "You've made a very poor investment in your future, Elena," Julian whispered, straightening his suit jacket. "I hope the truth is enough to buy you formula when I'm done with you." He turned and walked out of the office, his shadow retreating from the floor as quickly as it had arrived. Elena sat in the silence, her hands finally shaking. She looked through the glass at Sophie, who had woken up and was reaching for the plush giraffe. The CFO's shadow had passed, but the war had officially begun. She reached for her phone, not to text Caleb, but to message a contact she hadn't spoken to in years, a forensic accountant named Keller, who knew how to hide data where the light of a CFO could never find it. "I'm staying," she whispered to the empty room, her eyes returning to the screen. The accident of the text was a lifetime ago. The precision of the takedown was the only thing that mattered now.
The transition from corporate tension to visceral danger happened in the span of a single heartbeat. Elena Vance, a woman who had spent her life believing that numbers were the only things that could be truly cold, found herself standing in the ruins of her apartment. The door had been pried open with a mechanical brutality that left the wood splintered, and her few remaining possessions, relics of a life before the cold, hollow hour, had been tossed aside with a message of clear intent. Nothing had been stolen. The $5,000 cash she had withdrawn for emergencies was still in the drawer. The invasion wasn't about theft. It was about the CFO's shadow reaching out from the glass towers of Sterling Nexus to prove that nowhere was safe. She stood in the hallway, clutching Sophie to her chest so tightly the baby let out a soft, confused whimper. Elena's analytical mind, usually her greatest shield, was screaming a single, jagged truth. Julian Vane had stopped negotiating. She didn't call the police. She knew that a man who could move $12 million through ghost credentials could move a local precinct just as easily. Instead, she called the only person whose number had become a lifeline.
10 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled onto the curb of her rain-slicked street. Caleb Sterling didn't send an assistant. He stepped out of the vehicle himself, his face a mask of controlled, lethal fury that Elena had never seen before. He didn't ask if she was okay. He saw the state of the door and the way Elena's sharp, quiet force had been replaced by a raw, vibrating instinct to protect her child. "Get in the car, Elena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command. "We're leaving, now." As the city blurred past in a smear of gray and neon, Caleb stayed silent, his hand resting near the gear shift, inches from where Elena sat. The proximity felt different now. It wasn't just the billionaire and his redemption project anymore. They were two people in a foxhole, bonded by a secret that was becoming increasingly dangerous. They drove far beyond the familiar perimeter of the city, ascending into the rugged, pine-heavy air of the Cascades until the pavement gave way to a private, gated drive. The safe house was a masterpiece of architectural isolation, a structure of cedar, stone, and reinforced glass perched on the edge of a cliff. To the world, it was a reclusive billionaire's getaway. To Elena, as she stepped inside and heard the heavy, pressurized thud of the security locks engaging, it was a fortress. This is one of the few properties not listed under the Sterling Nexus corporate umbrella, Caleb explained, guiding her into a living area that smelled of wood smoke and expensive leather. The servers here are on a closed loop. Julian's ghost credentials can't find us here. You and Sophie will stay here until we have enough to end this. Elena walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the mist-covered valley below. Her deep flaw, that fierce, jagged independence, struggled against the reality of her situation. She hated being hidden. She hated that she needed a man in a glass tower to protect her from a man in an Italian suit. But then she felt the warmth of the house, the absolute silence that wasn't the silence of a dead apartment with no power, but the silence of true security. She looked at Sophie, who was already crawling toward a plush rug, blissfully unaware of the war being waged over her head. "Why go this far, Caleb?" Elena asked, her voice small against the vastness of the room. Caleb walked over to the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers catching the silver at his temples. He looked older in this light, more human. "I told you, Elena, I built that company to be something better than what the world is. If I let Julian turn it into a machine for his own greed, then I've lost everything that matters." And he paused, his gaze shifting at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I realized that the woman who sent that text wasn't just a stranger. She was the first person in 5 years who reminded me that the truth is worth fighting for." The evening settled into a strange domestic rhythm that Elena hadn't expected. Caleb didn't retreat into his office. He helped her set up a temporary nursery in one of the guest suites. He watched with a quiet, tender fascination as she prepared Sophie's bottle, his presence in the kitchen making the vast space feel intimate. For a few hours, the Trinox pattern and the ghost mogul disappeared. They were just two people sharing a meal in the quiet of the mountains. But the corporate war was never far away. After Sophie had fallen asleep, Elena set up her laptop on the heavy oak dining table. She connected to Caleb's private encrypted network and began to lay out the trap. She showed him the data she had recovered with the help of her contact Keller, the specific offshore accounts where the $12 million had been diverted. "We can't just fire him," Elena whispered, her analytical mind returning to full power. "He's too well entrenched. He'll burn the company down on his way out. We have to draw him into a move he can't explain away. We need him to think he's won." Caleb leaned over her shoulder, his proximity sending a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with the data on the screen. "He thinks you're a liability, Elena. He thinks your motherhood makes you soft. Let's use that against him." They sat together long into the night, mapping out the fake memo and the emergency ethics complaint they would leak to draw Julian out. As the fire died down to embers, Elena realized that the safe house had provided more than just physical protection. It had provided the space for a partnership to turn into something deeper, a shared purpose that went beyond ledgers and losses. "Elena," said Caleb softly, as she prepared to head to her room, "I'm sorry it had to come to this. I didn't mean to bring the storm to your front door." Elena looked at the man who answered a wrong number text with a life-changing sum of money. She thought of the woman she had been, broken, weary, and invisible. "The storm was already there, Caleb," she said, her iron-clad dignity shining in her eyes. "You just gave me the house to weather it in." As she closed the door to her suite, the click of the lock felt like the start of a new chapter. The accident was over, the precision was in place, and in the morning, the mother who had begged for $50 would start the process of dismantling a billionaire's enemy.
The morning at the Mountain Safe House arrived with a crisp, biting clarity that mirrored Elena Vance's mental state. Elena Vance, the brilliant former biochem researcher and forensic auditor, sat at the heavy oak table with a steaming mug of black coffee, her eyes reflecting the complex code flowing across her laptop screen. In the guest room, Sophie was safely tucked away, a contrast of innocence against the digital warfare Elena was about to unleash. Beside her, Caleb Sterling stood like a silent sentinel, his presence a powerful, calm force that had shifted from protector to partner over the course of a single night. Elena pulled up a secure, encrypted chat window. The name at the top was simply Keller, a man she hadn't seen in years, but whose loyalty to the truth was as ironclad as her own dignity. Keller was a ghost in the financial world, a forensic specialist who lived in the dark corners of the internet where data went to hide. "The bait is ready," Keller's message blinked onto the screen. "If he bites, the Trinox pattern will be undeniable." Elena looked up at Caleb. "We're not just looking for the money anymore, we're looking for the intent. Julian thinks I'm a liability because I'm a mother. We're going to use that shadow he cast over me to make him feel invincible." The plan was a trap built on psychological leverage. Elena and Keller had spent the small hours of the morning drafting a fake internal memo, a document designed to look like a panicked mistake. It suggested that Elena had accidentally discovered a massive accounting error in a subsidiary that had nothing to do with Trinox. To a predator like Julian Vane, it would look like Elena was incompetent, chasing a ghost while leaving the real treasure unguarded. "I'm sending it now," Elena whispered. With a single keystroke, she routed the memo through a leak in the internal Sterling Nexus server, making it appear as though she had tried to delete it in a panic. She knew Julian's monitoring software would flag it instantly. For 2 hours, the house was silent. Elena's deep flaw, her fierce independence, made the waiting unbearable. She wanted to fight, to confront, to audit, but this was a game of patience.
She watched the remote access logs of the Sterling Nexus mainframes, waiting for the ghost credentials to surface. Suddenly, the screen flared. "He's in," Elena said, her voice a sharp, quiet force. The logs showed an administrative override coming from Julian's private terminal. He wasn't just reading the memo, he was attempting to fix the error she had supposedly found, likely intending to use it as the final proof of her incompetence to present to the board. But in doing so, he had to open a secure channel to the very offshore accounts Elena and Keller had been tracking. "I've got the handshake," Keller's text appeared. "He's authenticated the Trinox link to his personal biometric ID to bypass the emergency lock. He thinks he's covering his tracks, but he just signed his own confession." Elena felt a surge of cold triumph. This was the precision Caleb had hired her for. Julian Vane had spent years building a machine to siphon funds, but he had finally been outmaneuvered by a woman who knew the value of a single digit. "He just filed an emergency ethics complaint against me," Elena told Caleb, her eyes hardening. "He's claiming I've compromised the integrity of the R&D accounts with unauthorized and erratic probing. He's calling for an immediate board review tomorrow morning to have me removed and my access investigated for criminal intent." Caleb walked behind her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. The warmth of the gesture was a far cry from the reclusive man she had first met. "He fell for it," he said. "He thinks he's walking into a boardroom to execute a charity case. He has no idea he's walking into a reckoning." Elena leaned back, the blue light of the screen highlighting the expressive, focused features that Caleb had first seen in her midnight text. The corporate war had moved from the shadows into the light. She looked toward the nursery where Sophie slept, the child who was the reason for every risk she took. "Tomorrow," Elena said, her voice a promise. The trap was set. Julian Vane had bit the lure, and in the morning, the CFO's shadow would find itself under the unforgiving glare of the truth. Elena Vance was no longer just a struggling mom. She was the architect of a billionaire's salvation. The air in the boardroom of Sterling Nexus was thin, sterile, and tasted of old money and impending judgment. Elena Vance, the brilliant former biochem researcher and forensic auditor, stood at the edge of the mahogany table, her fingers grazing the edge of her laptop as if it were a shield. She looked at the faces gathered around the room, men and women who had spent their lives building walls of capital to keep the world out. At the head of the table sat Caleb Sterling, his face a mask of granite, while Julian Vane sat opposite him, looking every bit the victor. Julian's shadow was long today, his posture relaxed, his expensive suit pristine. He believed he was here to witness the final erasure of a charity case. "Mr. Sterling, members of the board," Julian began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "It is with a heavy heart that I bring this emergency ethics complaint forward. We all wanted Elena's story to be one of success. We all wanted to believe that a struggling mother could find a home here. But the data doesn't lie. Miss Vance has been caught accessing restricted R&D accounts, attempting to manipulate ledger entries to cover what appears to be a significant series of unauthorized probing." He gestured toward the screen at the front of the room, where the fake memo Elena had leaked the night before was displayed in all its curated incompetence. This memo is a confession of a woman out of her depth, trying to invent a crisis to justify her paycheck. It's erratic, it's unprofessional, and it's dangerous. Elena felt the weight of the board's collective gaze, suspicion mixed with a cold corporate pity. Her deep flaw, that fierce independence, burned in her chest like a live coal, but she didn't let it flare into anger. Instead, she channeled it into the sharp, quiet force that had always been her true power. She looked at Caleb, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "I agree with Mr. Vane on one point," Elena said, her voice cutting through the room's tension with the precision of a scalpel. "The data doesn't lie, but the data Mr. Vane is showing you is a lure. It's a shadow meant to distract you from the light." With a steady hand, she tapped a sequence on her keyboard. The screen flickered, the fake memo vanishing to be replaced by a cascading waterfall of red and white text. It was the raw metadata from the Sterling mainframes, the digital DNA of every transaction made in the last 18 months. "This is the Trinox pattern," Elena announced, her eyes locked on Julian's, watching for the first crack in his composure. "Every red line you see represents a payment made to a shell company in Delaware. These payments were authorized using ghost credentials, hijacked identities of junior analysts and project managers across 3 continents." A murmur rippled through the board. Julian stood up, his face reddening. "This is a fabrication, a desperate attempt by an auditor with a vendetta." "I'm not done, Julian." Elena rose, her voice rising with an ironclad dignity that filled the room. "Last night at 11:42 p.m., an emergency override was initiated to clean the Trinox link. That override required a top-level biometric handshake. My colleague, Mr. Keller, and I were watching in real time. The signature used to authorize that override wasn't a ghost. It belonged to you." The screen shifted again, showing a high-resolution log of the biometric authentication, time-stamped and geotagged to Julian's private terminal. The machine he had built to siphon $12 million was now laid bare on the wall for everyone to see. The boardroom became a vacuum of silence. Julian looked around the table, but the faces that had been sympathetic moments ago were now cold as ice. He turned to Caleb, his voice cracking for the first time. "Caleb, you can't believe this. She's a researcher who fell on hard times. She's manipulating the code." "Enough, Julian," Caleb said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He stood up slowly, the reclusive mogul replaced by a man of absolute authority. "I didn't just hire Elena Vance because she's a mother who needed help. I hired her because she's the best forensic mind I've ever encountered. And while she was finding the cracks in the building, I was ensuring that once we found them, the walls wouldn't fall on the innocent." Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim black folder, sliding it on the mahogany table. The data Elena uncovered was shared with the Department of Justice 3 days ago. "We didn't just want a corporate firing, Julian. We wanted a federal reckoning." The heavy double doors of the boardroom opened, and 4 men in dark suits stepped inside. The lead agent didn't look at the board. He walked straight toward Julian Vane. "Julian Vane, you are arrested for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and identity theft." As the agents moved to escort Julian out, the CFO turned back to Elena, his face a mask of pure, concentrated hatred. "You think you've won? You're still just a girl who couldn't pay her electric bill. You're nothing without his charity." Elena stood her ground, her expressive, focused features radiating a calm she hadn't felt in a year. "I was never nothing, Julian. I was just invisible. Thank you for making sure everyone saw me today." The room was silent as Julian was led out in handcuffs. The CFO's shadow was gone, replaced by the bright, unforgiving light of the truth. The board members, once skeptical, now looked at Elena with a mixture of awe and professional respect. Caleb walked over to her, his presence no longer a fortress she was trying to scale, but a bridge she had finally crossed. "You did it, Elena," he whispered, his eyes softening with a tender pride that had nothing to do with the company's bottom line. "We did it," she corrected him, her hand finally relaxing its grip on her laptop. The boardroom showdown was over, but as Elena looked out the window at the city below, she realized the stakes had changed. She had saved the company's legacy, but in the process, she had reclaimed her own. She thought of Sophie, safe in the custom-built nursery, and realized that the cold, hollow hour was finally, truly behind her. The silence that followed the storm of Julian Vane's arrest was not the hollow, cold silence of Elena's kitchen floor, but a quiet, expectant peace that filled the executive suite of Sterling Nexus. Elena Vance, the brilliant former biopem researcher and forensic auditor, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching the rain-slicked streets of Seattle far below. She was no longer a ghost in the machine or a charity case hiding in the shadows of a billionaire's guilt. She was a woman who had looked into the heart of a corporate empire, found the rot, and cut it out with the precision of a surgeon. Her analytical mind, once consumed by the frantic math of survival, was now occupied with the logistical complexities of her new reality. Her deep flaw, the fierce, jagged independence that had made her suspicious of every kindness, was still there, but it had softened into a quiet confidence. She knew now that accepting help wasn't a sign of failure, it was the foundation of a partnership. Through the glass partition of the nursery, she watched Sophie. The baby was sitting in a patch of afternoon sunlight, clutching the plush giraffe and babbling at her own reflection in the polished wood of the crib. The sight was a living anchor for Elena, a reminder that the cold, hollow hour of midnight was a world away. She had done it. She had secured a future where the formula was never watered down and the lights would never go out. A soft, rhythmic knock at the door drew her attention. Caleb Sterling stood there, leaning against the frame. He had traded his boardroom armor for a simple dark sweater, looking more like the man who followed up a $5,000 transfer with a question about a baby's well-being than the mogul who owned the skyline. He walked into the room, his presence filling the space with that powerful, calm energy that Elena had come to rely on. He didn't stay by the door. He walked straight to her desk and set down a single, elegant folder. The board met for 3 hours after the federal agents left, Elena. They've seen the full extent of the Trinox pattern, and they've seen the woman who dismantled it. Elena opened the folder. It wasn't just a contract extension, it was a permanent appointment as the Director of Internal Audit for Sterling Nexus, with a seat on the executive committee and a compensation package that made her eyes sting for a moment. It was a role that recognized her not as a mother who needed a job, but as the sharpest mind in the building. "This is more than we discussed, Caleb," Elena whispered, her ironclad sense of dignity making her pause even now. "It's what the company needs, Elena, and it's what you earned," Caleb countered, stepping closer. "Julian thought he could use your struggle as a weapon against you. He thought motherhood made you a liability. He was wrong. It made you the only person in this building with enough at stake to actually see the truth." He turned toward the window, looking out at the city he had spent 5 years hiding from. "For a long time, I thought Sterling Nexus was a monument to the past. I thought I was just presiding over a museum of things I had lost. I kept my circle small because I didn't think there was anyone left who wasn't looking for a way to take a piece of the empire for themselves." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips,
And then I got a text about $50 for formula. Elena felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the office's climate control. I still can't believe I hit the wrong digit of all the people in this city to message. That's the thing, Elena, Caleb said, turning back to face her. His gaze was tender and unfailingly honest. I've spent a lifetime calculating risks and predicting outcomes. I've spent millions on algorithms to tell me what's coming next. But that text, that was the only thing I didn't see coming. It was an accident that wasn't an accident. It was the first right thing to happen to me in years. He walked over to the glass partition, looking at Sophie for a long moment before looking back at Elena. You saved this company from a predator, but you saved me from becoming a ghost in my own life. You brought the light back into this building. Elena walked to him, her hand resting briefly on his arm, a gesture of trust she wouldn't have been capable of weeks ago. You gave me the house to weather the storm, Caleb. I just made sure the windows were clean enough to see through. The transition was complete. The struggling single mom of the headlines was gone, replaced by a woman of sharp, quiet force who had found her place at the table. As the sun began to set over the sound, casting a golden glow over the nursery and the office alike, Elena realized that the wrong number had led her to the only home she and Sophie had ever truly known. The accident was over. The future was a precision-engineered reality. Caleb reached out, his fingers brushing hers as they stood by the glass. So, Director Vance, what's the first item on your agenda for tomorrow? Elena looked at the plush giraffe, then at the man who had become her anchor, and finally at the city waiting for her to make her mark. I think, she said, her voice steady and certain, I'd like to start by making sure no one else in this city ever has to send a text at midnight because they're $50 short on a dream. Caleb nodded, his hand closing over hers. The accident that wasn't had become a legacy in the making.
What do you think? Was the wrong number fate or just a lucky break? I'd love to see your comments and theories. If you liked this chapter, please like and share to help others discover it. Make sure to subscribe so you're the first to know when the next story drops.